before we get started, mention to everyone that the group gets together every night to say 4 chapters of Psalms in accordance with the directive of the chief rabbi of Israel since the war started, which is possible to do over Zoom. So if you are interested in receiving the link, just join and you can be part of it. Very important effort by Sukkot Shalom. So tonight I want to lay down a theoretical framework as we begin to move through the other 6 mitzvot. We touched upon a few issues related to the topic of murder in the past 2 shiurim, and we are going to be coming back to each one of the Sheva mitzvot in its own time as topics arise. I want to point out that although there are 7 distinct categories of mitzvot, there are conceptual connections and overlaps that they all share. So we are going to sort of dive in and come back and dive in again and come back over here and circle back this way. So we're going to be moving into the topic of theft tonight. I'm going to be laying down a theoretical framework in which we can understand this from a philosophical standpoint before we get to the nitty-gritty details of theft, which is certainly a very relevant topic, especially in this world today. I'm going to begin with the first part of chapter 6 in the book of Genesis, which outlines essentially the fall of mankind before the flood. We have to ask, what exactly was it that was the straw that broke the camel's back, proverbially? In other words, what was the last straw of all the sins committed by the generation of the flood? What was the thing that angered Hashem so much that he decided to destroy humanity and all creatures living on the earth? So let's look inside. It says as following: when humankind began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them. Here it says the divine beings saw how pleasing the human women were and took wives from among those who delighted them. In the Hebrew it says Vayir'u B'nei Elohim, right, at Benot Hadam, that the B'nei HaElohim saw Benot Hadam. Here the word Elohim is not referring to God, but is referring to people of importance and or power and influence. There are other explanations for this category of people as well. Some hold that these are actually mystical beings or angelic beings or beings of an entirely superhuman variety. But if we just take the basic idea that these are people in positions of power. And what they did was they saw all the pretty ladies on earth, and and they took for themselves wives from whoever they chose. Now God said, "My breath shall not abide in humankind forever, since it too is flesh. And let the days allowed them be 120 years. Human beings lived a very long time prior to this decree. Essentially, the maximum human lifespan is set by God, not necessarily applicable to the generation of Noach or his children, or many of the personalities that we find in the book of Genesis, but that would ultimately become the maximum lifespan of a human being. It's 120 years. And this is actually what we find scientifically today, that most likely human beings could, in potential, live until 120. There's always a joke that goes around, what do you say to somebody on their 119th birthday? Because usually the blessing for people is Ad Mea V'Esrim, which means you should live to 120. So it's it's a bit of a dilemma. Okay, and it was then later to the Nephilim appeared on earth when divine beings cohabited with the human women and bore them offspring. Such were the heroes of old, the men of renown. God saw how great was human wickedness on earth, how every plan devised by the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. And God regretted having made humankind on earth. With a sorrowful heart, these are all anthropomorphisms. We can't understand them literally. We're going to have to understand them in the literary sense. It says that Shalom-B'nei Adam, that the Torah speaks in the language of man. In other words, it uses human language in order for us to be able to relate to it. But of course, God does not experience emotions as we experience emotions. God said, I will blot out from the earth humankind whom I created, humans together with animals, creeping things and birds of the sky, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor with God. This is the line of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his age. Noah walked with God. Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth became corrupt before God. The earth was filled with lawlessness. When God saw how corrupt the earth was, for all flesh had corrupted its ways on the earth, that's when he introduces himself to Noah and tells him of the impending flood. So we're going to have to look at a few different pieces of this also in the Hebrew. Number one, we have this issue, as we saw, of the B'nei Elohim taking women as wives. We're going to explain that. But specifically, it says that V'tishachet ha'aretz lifnei Elohim, that the earth became corrupt. Tishachet, hashchata is corruption, became corrupted before God. V'timalei ha'aretz chamas, and the entire earth was filled with lawlessness. Notice that the word for lawlessness, which is the state, the spiritual state, the state of corruption that had been reached before the flood, is in Hebrew chamas. If you think there is a coincidence, I tell you there is no coincidence. However, let's move on. Rashi explains, what does it mean that the world was filled with lawlessness? I just want to point out that what we understand is once the verse says, "V'timalei ha'aretz chamas," that the earth became filled with lawlessness, that's the tipping point. At that point in time, the flood is imminent. Rashi explains, ki malei ha'aretz chamas. Interesting. Rashi sort of changes the wording. Lo nechtam gzar dinam ela al hagezel. Rashi says that their fate was sealed, meaning to say that the din, that the judgment that was issued from before God was issued because of the sin of gezel, of theft. Now, Rashi is basing himself on a piece in the Gemara in Sanhedrin on page 108a. Says the following things, because and it picks up really from this point when God begins to speak to Noah. Vayomer Hashem leNoach, God says to Noah, Kates kol basar ba lefanai. The end of all flesh has come before me. And we know the rest of the verse, which is that for the earth is filled with robbery through them, theft, and behold, I will destroy them from the earth. This is where we get this idea. I mean, it's actually spelled out in the verse itself, that the earth is filled with Hamas. The earth is filled with violence or theft, and therefore I will destroy them with the earth. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan says, come and see how great the power of, or let's say how great the effects of Hamas are, of theft. Shaharei Dor Hamabul, as we see the generation of the flood of Ru al Hakol, they had essentially transgressed everything. When we say that they transgressed everything, we are referring to the Sheva Mitzvot B'nei Noach. Okay, you can't pin this one on us because we weren't around at the time. This was all you. And they were over on it all. They had transgressed absolutely everything. But lo nechtam alehem gazar dinam, but the final decree had not been made upon them ad shepashtu yedehem begezel, until they reached out their hands and began taking from other people, began stealing from other people. Shene'emar, as the verse tells us in Genesis chapter 6, verse 13, Ki mala haaretz chamas mipnehem, for the whole earth was filled with theft. Behineni mashchitam et haaretz, and the earth became destroyed, or I shall destroy them from the earth, rather. Uchtiv, and it says a verse in Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 11, robbery is risen up into a rod of wickedness. Nothing comes from them, nor from their multitude, nor from any of them, nor shall there be wailing for them. We're not even going to mourn the loss of these people. They're just going to be completely obliterated. Now, we have to ask the question, if you compare murder and idolatry and sexual immorality to somebody, taking a banana that doesn't belong to them, why would we ever think that theft would outweigh all of these things to such an extent that God decides based on the theft that it's time to destroy the world? That's the question. What's so bad about it? I mean, it's not good. We know it's not good. Everybody knows it's not good. But why is it so bad that the whole earth deserves to be destroyed because of it? So there are two perspectives on why this is. The first that I'm going to mention here from Torah Tamima, Genesis chapter 6, verse 13, he said the following thing. He says, we do not clearly understand why theft has such a greater power than the sin of promiscuity, or Gilui Arayot, especially when the sin of promiscuity is one of those for which one should prefer death over transgression. Okay, that is something that holds true for Jewish people. They are supposed to choose death before they transgress the sin of Gilui Arayot, if they are forced to choose between death and forms of sexual immorality. It is one of what we call the three cardinal sins. This would not be true for B'nai Noach, who are not required to be Mekadesh Shem Shamayim, are not required to give their lives for the purpose of sanctifying the name in a public way. But we can see, at least from this point, how severe that is. According to one opinion in the Midrash, in this portion, Parshat Vayetze in part 38, also in Tractate Sanhedrin, he's mentioning a few different sources, says the following thing. Gadol HaShalom, great is peace. How do we see the peace is great? For even if Israel worships idols, but yet there is peace among them, God says, as it were, I can't control them. As it is stated in the prophet Hosea, chapter 4, verse 17, Ephraim is joined to idols, let him alone. Meaning to say that if there's peace between the Jews, amongst the Jews, then we can sink to a very, very low spiritual level and not be punished en masse by God. However, says the Torah Tamima, when they engage in theft, which causes strife and hatred, they are then blamed and punished for all the sins that were in their possession from the beginning. What do we learn from here? Theft has a specific power to break down the social order. In other words, peace between people is something that protects against divine retribution. But theft works in such a way that when you take away a person's right to their own personal property, you cause hatred. You cause people to become defensive, and therefore the protective quality of peace between people is no longer there, which is why the Torah Tamima is saying that once that protective layer is gone, they're then blamed and punished for all the sins that were in their possession from the beginning. Now, the second perspective that I'm going to bring here isn't really a second perspective because it comes from the Ramban, who lived during the 13th century. The Torah Tamima lived during the 20th century. But he's picking up on a different point, that this is not just a matter of breaking down the social order. In other words, the Torah Tamima is coming to explain why it is that theft is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And his thesis here is that because it causes people to hate each other and to fight with each other, because everybody's anxiety level is raised and they don't know who's coming next to take away what rightfully belongs to them. And therefore, the protective layer of peace is gone. Peace is the glue that holds society together. When there is no peace between people, societies begin to fall apart. Take a look around the world and you will see that right in front of our eyes. Now, the Ramban is going to bring something else. This is hearkening back to verse 2 of chapter 6 in Genesis. It says the following thing. Let's go back to the verse. The verse says, Vayir'u v'nei ho-Elohim, the B'nei ho-Elohim saw at Benot Adam, the daughters of man, ki tovot hena, that they were beautiful, that they were good, that they were pleasing. Vayikchu lahem nashim, and they took for themselves wives mikol asher bacharu. Anyone they chose, they took her as a wife. The Ramban clarifies that yikchu otan lahem lenashim ba'ones. They took these women forcibly. V'sipera katuv, the verse tells us what it defines, essentially, the Hamas, the thievery, the violence that's inherent in this act. And it says that they took mikol asher bacharu, from anyone they chose, including women who were married to other people. So they broke through the boundary of marital sanctity and took the wife, if that's what they saw fit to do. But notice that nowhere in that verse do we see anything about, let's say, the word niyuf, which means adultery, or the more general term of gilui arayot, of sexual immorality. You don't see it anywhere in that verse. And only later on, when the verse mentions Hamas, that the world had become filled with, or the land had become filled with Hamas, does it begin the process of the punishment of the flood. The Ramban says, Lo nigzar alehem ha'onesh rak ala chamas. The punishment only came because of the thievery. Why? Lefi shehu inyan muskal. Because it's a logical concept. Enenu tzarich l'Torah. You don't need a Torah to tell you that stealing is wrong. Therefore, God becomes much more exacting when it comes to things that you should have known. Several places we will find a phrase of Chazal that says, if it had not been written in the Torah itself, we would have had to have written it, because it's so obvious to all of us. It's something that is just universally understood by humanity to be wrong. So here we have two perspectives. One being that peace is gone, the protective layer is gone, and therefore, even though we see that the Gezar Din, or the Chatimata Din, right, the sealing of the judgment against humanity, or against the world, was because of theft, it doesn't mean necessarily that that's all there was to it. But that the protective layer of peace that gets destroyed through theft essentially is like the dam holding the flood back. And once that's gone, here it comes. The Ramban deepens this understanding by showing how, yes, it goes all the way back really to the beginning of the chapter, where we see that people abuse their power and simply take any woman that they choose for themselves. So it's another level of theft that also involves essentially stealing somebody else's wife. So we have in that situation also the addition of adultery, of Gilui Arayot, and therefore we understand that it's really the combination of bad things that leads ultimately to the consequences. Now, we have to also ask the question, still, even with the Ramban's explanation that you know why theft becomes the tipping point, because they should have known better, because it's a logical concept. Okay, but still, there are still crimes that are worse. Meaning, like how it's a good explanation. Far be it from me to judge the Ramban, but I think there's still room to ask, like, what is it exactly that makes that the why is it that why is it the fact that it's logical make it worse? Because after all, we have 7 mitzvot, meaning it's an aveira, it's a transgression, just like the other 6 mitzvot. So the fact that it's logical, how does it worsen anything? Now we have to look at a theological perspective on human beings. What is the difference between human beings and animals? What's the yitron? What is the advantage of human beings over animals? We notice that the flood destroyed everybody, destroyed all living things. Back to chapter 1, verse 26, Vayomer Elokim Naseh Adam B'Tzalmenu Kidmutenu. And God said, let us make mankind in our image after our likeness. V'yirdu bidgat hayam. They should have dominion over the fish of the sea, uva hashamayim, and over the birds of the air, uva behema, and over all domesticated animals, or not necessarily domesticated, v'chol haaretz, over the whole earth, v'chol haremes haromes al haaretz, and on all creeping things that creep over the earth. Now, it's very interesting language. Naaseh Adam. Why does the verse say, let us make mankind in our image? This is like a field day for Christian missionaries, but you should not be led astray. After all, it does say that God created man in the singular. So who's we? Who's us over here? Now, Rashi says, Nase Adam, explaining that language. Here we learn the humility of the Holy One, blessed be He. Interesting. Why would God need the trait of humility whatsoever? In other words, gava or pride or grandeur is certainly a characteristic that would be perfectly legitimate and fitting when it comes to God. Nevertheless, we see that we are supposed to emulate our Creator, and one of the midot, one of the characteristics we are supposed to emulate, is His anivut, His humbleness. Lefish Adam hu b'demut hamalachim, since man would be made in the likeness of the angels, and therefore they would become jealous of man. God, so to speak, made it an easier thing for the angels by taking counsel with them, making it almost sound like let's both create man, as if they have a share in it, as if they have some sort of a way of participating. The Ramban has a different take on it. God said, let us make man. There was a special command dedicated to the making of man because of his great superiority, since his nature is unlike that of beasts and cattle, which were created with the preceding command. In other words, why would there need to be two different commands on the sixth day? You know, if we're talking about all flesh, if we're talking about all moving things, all living things, all animals, why did there need to be one verse for the animals and another verse for man? The Ramban says the correct explanation of naseh, which is let us make man, that's the plural form when it should have been in the singular, is as follows. It has been shown to you that God created something from nothing. We say that God creates ex nihilo, or in Hebrew, yesh me'ayin, that the world was brought into existence from nothingness. But the Ramban says that's only on the first day, because once he created the universe, then all of the material from which everything else is created is already present. Therefore, after the first day, God is essentially creating yesh mi yesh, something from something. So he then made things from those created elements. Thus, when he gave the waters the power of bringing forth a living soul, it says Yishritzu Hamayim in Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, that it sounds like it's saying that the waters themselves should cause things to swarm in the sea. That the sea creatures are essentially made from the elements that are present in the waters. And Hamamar Babahema, when it comes to animals, Totsei Haaretz. Right? That's verse 24. That essentially the earth is producing the animals. The animals are produced from the material that the earth is made of. When it comes to man, on the other hand, it says naaseh. It's not simply a command given to a singular party to generate that thing, but is actually a call to collaboration. What does that mean? Ani v'ha'aretz. It's going to be me, says God, and the aretz, and the land is going to be involved in the creation of mankind. Na'aseh Adam, we will create man. Shetotzi ha'aretz haguf miyisodeha. The earth will put forth the body, the physical body of human beings from the elements that are present in the earth. And that is absolutely true. If we look at our bodies, we are calcium, we are phosphorus, we are proteins and water, all the things that you can find in the soil. That's why we are called Adam. We are named after the Adamah, after the ground. Right. So, right, and it says that V'yitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam afar min ha'adamah. Created him out of the dust of the ground. But then it also said, now what's the collaborative element? The fact that God then placed a soul in that physical body. And that's why it says, Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim. He blew the breath of life into the nostrils of Adam. And this is how essentially Adam is animated. Nothing like this is said about the animals. The animals also need to be animated in some way. But we are essentially, our life force is the very soul that God has placed within us. And as we know, that when you blow something into something else, what you are blowing out is coming from the very depths of you, right? In other words, the air that you breathe out came from within you, came from within the deepest recesses of your body. So the idea of Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim, that he blew the breath of life into the nostrils of Adam, is telling us that God has placed within man something that is essentially internal to God himself, which is the soul. Right. Now it said also, we said, B'tzalmenu kidmutenu, that Adam is going to be made in the image and likeness of God. How so? Because man is similar to both elements, both the earthly element and the spiritual element. There really is no difference from a physical standpoint between human beings and animals. We have the same 10 or 11 organ systems. You know, we have pretty much the same needs. I'm not talking about the cerebral cortex type needs. I'm talking about the most basic instinctive, needs of hydration and nutrition and everything else, shelter and the like. But we have in us nishmat chayim. We have the breath of life that has been given to us, the soul that's been given to us by God. And therefore, when it says B'tzalmenu kidmutenu, we are more God-like. We resemble God more because we have this extra item, which brings wisdom, which brings a spiritual sense. And therefore it says in the image of God, he created him in order to relate the distinction by which man is distinguished from the rest of the created beings. That means that human beings have two directions that they could go in. They could be drawn after the physical aspect of themselves, or they could be drawn after the spiritual, drawn downward or drawn upwards. That's the choice that is in the hands of a human being. Now, just to continue this a little further, we have a blessing that we recite, we Jews recite, after we have used the restroom, which ends with Baruch atah Hashem, Rofeh chol basar mafli lasod. Blessed are you, Lord, who heals all flesh and does wonders. The blessing itself shows our appreciation for the wondrousness, the workings of the body, that all of the processes have to work perfectly in order for us to live and survive. And we take the opportunity, specifically after using the bathroom, to put our consciousness there. But if you'll notice the text of the blessing itself, the Ramah in the next source explains. This is the Ramah on Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, chapter 6, subheading 1. It says, another explanation is when we say that God does wondrous things, refers to the fact that God keeps the spirit of man within his body and binds something spiritual to something physical. That's an incredible thing. And all this is possible because he is the healer of all flesh, and then man stays healthy and his soul is maintained within his body. So we have Rofei chol basar, healer of all flesh, umafli la'asot, but also does wonders. What is the Pella? What is this incredible wonder that is present here? You see from the blessing itself a combination of the physical, the basar, the flesh, and mafli la'asot, the wonders, the soul. And the fact that these two things are married together. Now, because this is the case, we have to understand that we are expected, although we are physical beings, to incline ourselves in a spiritual direction so that we can maintain our humanity. A lot of people, we love animals. Pets are family. However, one should never think that animals are equal to human beings. The Torah itself specifies that we possess something that animals do not have. Animals also have a life force of some kind, some type of nefesh. But it is not a nefesh that gives them discernment. It's not a nefesh that gives them wisdom. It's a nefesh that keeps them alive. What does that tell us? Since we share that same nefesh with them, and yet we have this angelic aspect to us, is that if we are drawn fully after the physical, we lose our superiority to animals. So we are expected to stay at a level above that. And that is what is seen in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. It says the following thing, Vayomer Hashem, God says, Lo yadon ruchi ba'adam. It's translated as my breath shall not abide in man forever. But the Hebrew, it says, Lo yadun ruchi ba'adam. My spirit shall not dwell within man la'olam, forever. When or why? B'shagam hu basar. As long as he is a fleshly, physical being, the soul will not dwell forever within him. And that's when he makes this stipulation that the human physical life should be 120 years long. There's several different implications here. That we were just discussing the composition of human beings being both physical and spiritual. When is it that there's no eternality to life? That's bishagamhu basar. That's when we have sunk completely to the level of the physical. When we have completely succumbed to our physical desires, we have made ourselves essentially unfit to be that resting place for the soul. So therefore, there's a limit that God puts, and He's done us a tremendous favor by doing this. Because if you knew you were going to live forever, you really wouldn't get around to doing the important things. You'd procrastinate because you knew you had another 900 years. But if you know you only have 120, you know that the clock's ticking, and you know that at some point you got to get it together. What's the point of that? We know that God waits until that very last day for you to do tshuva. God created the world with His divine attribute of severe judgment, but saw that the world would not stand that way, and therefore He combined His attribute of compassion to His attribute of judgment. And that at that point He begins to be called Hashem Elohim. That essentially is the creation of the possibility of repentance, of doing tshuva, so that you essentially have your entire lifespan to clean up your act and to come close to God and to return to God and to do what He wants from you. So again, I know that I'm dealing with a mixed audience in the sense of knowledge of Hebrew. So I'm trying to make sure that you get this point. That language in the verse, though, bishagamhu basar. If He's going to be completely physical, then God's spirit cannot rest within Him. He has to elevate Himself. He has to pull Himself up. Viktor Frankl took issue with the Freudian conception of the human being, of the human personality. Freud said that, I deal with the ground floor of existence. The idea that at the bottom of the human personality lays this animal, this id, that just wants to eat and drink and sleep and kill and rape. And that essentially is the essence of mankind, that if you take everything away from him, we can reduce a human being to that most elemental thing. Frankl said that's not the essence of mankind. The essence of mankind is the other direction. And he said, no one will be able to tell us that that man is a repressed animal when we will demonstrate that he is actually a repressed angel. We have to understand that is our natural state, and we have to move in the direction of it. We have to uncover that part of ourselves. It gets buried under because of the life that we lead in the physical world. It's very difficult to pull ourselves away from it, but that's our work in life. And we said that we know that this is true because we specifically have the verse in chapter 2, verse 7, that vayipach be'apav nishmat chayim, that God breathed into us this breath of life, this living soul. And therefore we are distinguished from animals, and therefore should not be drawn there, right? So in short, just to summarize what we've done so far, I think what this brings us to is that theft, when we've completely blasted through the boundaries that hold society together, that distinguish one person from the other, we have to understand where we end and where somebody else begins. And personal property is that place. That's one of the main indicators that tells you what is somebody else's and what is yours. That shows you where the boundary is. When we have blurred those boundaries and we begin to take that which is not ours, what we have done essentially is we have descended to the level of the animal. We have descended to that level of b'shegamhu basar, focusing only on our physical desires at that point, and not seeing the magnificence that we possess, that is indicated by those sacred boundaries that exist between people. And therefore, God is the one who decides what you have and what the next person has. It's not like you can look at somebody else's possessions and say, hey, why does he have it and I don't? That is entirely God's decision. What you get and what the next person gets. The fact that what you have is absolutely custom made for you to correspond exactly to your needs. The fact that we don't perceive it is an issue of consciousness, but it's an actual expression of God's divine guiding power in the world. Therefore, when we engage in theft, or let's say when the generation of the flood began to engage in theft, that was it. That was like the end of it all. Once they began to take from each other, there really was no more society to speak of. There was no human society to speak of that could be sustained anymore, which brought the flood. So just some philosophical type insights. We see also, by the way, I think it was Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, who said that the only two categorical imperatives, the most obvious things that are actually sins that anybody could recognize, would be the sins of murder and theft, because those are the two things that once a person assumes that if somebody else has something that he wants, he can take it, or if somebody's annoyed him that he has the right to kill him, that's when everything absolutely breaks down. But it's nice to see that it's reflected in other people's philosophical writings. But this is exactly what the Torah tells us. This is exactly what the Ramban is saying, that because it is something that is so obvious to anybody. What deep point? This is a very deep point here. Let's go back to that Ramban for a second. He called it inyan muskal. And it's an inyan muskal, and therefore eineno tzarich l'Torah. If it's a logical precept, you don't need a Torah for that. We say derech eretz kadma l'Torah. The ability to act like a human being precedes the ability to receive Torah. Torah gives us mitzvot, gives us commands that are super rational. We wouldn't have known it unless it was revealed to us. So the things that we should know, that's God is much more exacting about those things. Very, very deep point. So when society reaches a place where it forgets what it should know, it forgets what is basic wisdom that is endowed to human beings, and this has completely been shoved out of consciousness, that's when society has reached the end point. And that's what brought us here. So my blessing to you and to myself and to all of us is that we be very sensitive to the things that we should understand instinctively in order to become much more aware of our own behavior, of how we comport ourselves. We're going to launch into a world of what it means to have private property and what it means to violate that, and why that is one of the Sheva Mitzvot. May God bless us all.